Good evening. My name is Rabbi Herschel Lutch. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Tikva Fund. And on behalf of myself and everyone here at Tikva, we're so pleased that you've joined us for tonight's class on the history of Zionism, Building the Impossible Dream with Dr. Daniel Polisar. Tonight's lecture will focus on modern Zionism before the life, legacy, and work of Theodor Herzl. This class with Dr. Polisar was recently recorded live in our Jerusalem offices and is being shared with the American audience this evening due to the time difference. Before we go now to Dr. Polisar, I would like to thank Lee and Gary Rosenthal for their generosity in sponsoring tonight's lecture and making this enterprise possible. The Tikva Fund at every level is committed to thoughtful, serious, and deep educational exposures and experiences for students of every age and background. And Tikva is always innovating. I'm happy to share with you now that this August we're launching a new program for intellectually spirited and curious young people in grades 7 through 12. Our August series of great speeches will explore some of the most impactful texts, leaders, and orators from the Western, Jewish, and American traditions. If you yourself are a middle or high school student, or you know middle and high school students who would be interested in learning more about this new and exciting program, I encourage you to share our website, www.tikvafund.org, to learn more. And without any further delay, Dr. Polisar.
In the last session, we looked at the prospects for establishing a Jewish state as they seemed to be at the very beginning of the 19th century. And in particular, we focused on the double blow that Napoleon Bonaparte landed against the Jews, first by seeming to promise them a return to Zion, to Jerusalem, and to control in Israel under his protection. And failing in that very quickly, he, 7 years later, did precisely the opposite and demanded of the Jews of France, and by extension the Jews of Europe, that in exchange for his making sure that they got equal rights as citizens and had economic opportunities, they had to give up the dream of returning to Zion and a sense of Jewish nationhood and a sense of Jewish peoplehood, and essentially downsize themselves from the Jewish people into the Jewish religion. And so, as things stood at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, it seemed like that dream was over. And then we fast forwarded 2 centuries and 2 decades to the present, and we saw that in fact such a state arose in 1948, and it was marked by 4 extraordinary features in terms of its domestic character. Kibbutz Galuyot, that is, it is a state of the Jews and by the Jews with a very strong Jewish majority. It is a state for the Jews, that's the second element, the Jewish national state. It is a democracy against all odds in the Middle East, and it is an economically strong country. So those were the 4 remarkable elements of Israel internally, and we looked at it within the international system and saw that Israel was militarily a very strong country. Second, that it has a virtually unprecedented long-term alliance with the United States, the world's leading power, that's lasted for more than half a century. And finally, that it's increasingly accepted in the Middle East. And what we'll begin to do today and continue to do for the rest of this course is to understand how something that appeared so totally, overwhelmingly impossible, in fact, happened. And the beginning point for that is to understand that things were not all that they seemed to be in the early 19th century. Yes, the Jews had been dealt a devastating blow to their dreams of a return to Zion. And yes, many Jews had in fact given up on that dream in exchange for what they believed would be true equality within Europe, what went under the name of emancipation. And yet, underneath that current, underneath that was a very, very deep well of Jewish sentiment, of Jewish resources that cut in precisely the opposite direction, that wouldn't let the dream die. And very often when you want to know what's happening within your own people, the best way to do it is to observe what's said about you by others. So famously in the Bible, it is not any of the sons of Israel, Bnei Israel, the children of Jacob in Egypt, who determined that the Jews are a nation, but rather it's Pharaoh, Paro, who looks at them and says, this is what a nation looks like, and it's starting to get pretty scary. Although in biblical Hebrew, he didn't say it quite in those words. If you think about the best book ever written on American democracy, it wasn't written by an American, and it wasn't written by somebody from England. It was written by Alexis de Tocqueville, and it's called Democracy in America. And so, as I was thinking about the best way to understand what these undercurrents were within the Jewish world, I came upon what at the time was a best-selling, hysterically, wildly best-selling travelogue written by none other than the Viscount François-René Chateaubriand. Now, he is best known today, of course, for the stake that bears his name, and in fact, he knew how to live the good life when he traveled around the world and when he was in France. He was himself a member of the nobility, and a very, very well-educated person of enormous courage. And in 1806 and 1807, he set out on a journey where he went to Greece, Palestine, Egypt, and what he called Barbary, what we would call North Africa. And he wrote about that journey. I was, of course, interested in particular in what he wrote about Palestine, and there's virtually nothing in it about the Jews, except for two long paragraphs. The first one, he describes Jewish poverty and how these Jewish people are living in terrible conditions where they're literally fighting back against the vermin, the lice, and other parasites that are attacking them, so that we could understand just how bad Jewish life was. And when I got to that, I thought, well, this is not going to be such an uplifting description. And yet you read on, and you have one of the most remarkable descriptions, I believe, of Jewish resilience and of Jewish strength. So we've reproduced the text here, and I want to read it and then try to understand from it what are these elements of Jewish strength and passion about recreating a nation, a state, in the land of Israel. So he writes, and obviously I'm reading from the English translation. He wrote originally in French, but it was translated to many languages because so many people were fascinated by this. While the new Jerusalem thus rises from the desert, resplendent in brightness, cast your eyes between the temple and Mount Zion. Behold another petty tribe cut off from the rest of the inhabitants of this city. He's talking about the Jews. The particular objects of every species of degradation, these people bow their heads without murmuring. They endure every kind of insult without demanding justice. They sink beneath repeated blows without sighing. If their head be required, they present it to the scimitar. On the death of any member of this prescribed community, his companion goes at night and inters him by stealth in the valley of Yehoshaphat, in the shadow of Solomon's temple. So on the one hand, he's presenting this people who are resilient, they keep coming back, and they're willing to do things stealthily. Why? In order to bury, not themselves, but to bury their brethren, their friends, their neighbors, their family members in the shadow of Solomon's temple, which apparently was not something that you were allowed to do in an open and public way. And he goes on, because now he's looking at them from the outside, but now he's coming closer. Enter the abodes of these people. You will find them amidst the most abject wretchedness, instructing their children to read a mysterious book, which they in their turn will teach their offspring to read. What they did 5,000 years ago, these people still continue to do. So we can forgive them for giving us an extra 1,000+ years. And the thing that they did 5,000 years ago, this book, it's the Bible. And he's just really impressed that they're continuing to read the Bible. And in the paragraph that he wrote that I'm not quoting from, he does say that he came upon somebody teaching, apparently teaching his son, and the Viscount de Chateaubriand very much wanted this Hebrew book. And he could have paid a lot for it and was willing to, and this impoverished gentleman would not sell the Hebrew book for anything, because this was the book he was using to teach his son, to teach his student. He goes on, 17 times have they witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, yet nothing can discourage them, nothing can prevent them from turning their faces towards Zion. To see the Jews scattered over the whole world according to the word of God must doubtless excite surprise. But to be struck with supernatural astonishment, you must view them at Jerusalem. You must behold these rightful masters of Judea living as slaves and strangers in their own country. You must behold them expecting under all oppressions a king who is to deliver them, right? He started with a zoning, kind of zooming out. Then he entered their abodes. Then he stepped back out to say, just think about it. 17 times Jerusalem is destroyed, and yet there's this community, 10,000 strong, of Jews who are living here, and they don't turn their faces away from Zion. And they're waiting for this king, right? He's obviously referring there to Mashiach, to a Messiah who's going to deliver them and bring them back. And then he steps even further back and looks at them not in their own context, but in the context of all of world history. And he says, crushed by the cross that condemns them and is planted on their heads, skulking near the temple of which not one stone is left upon another, right? They're staying here even though there's no physical remnants as far as he knew. In fact, there were and there are, but as far as he knew, there were no remnants of the temple. They continue in their infatuation, in this passion. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans are swept from the earth. And a petty tribe whose origin preceded that of those great nations still exists unmixed among the ruins of its native land. Right? They don't mix with other people, and they still have come back generation after generation in the worst circumstances. If anything among nations wears the character of a miracle, that character, in my opinion, is here legibly impressed. Right? Yet again, Chateaubriand, an observer, not somebody who one would describe as philo-Semitic, a lover of the Jews, a lover of Zion, but he couldn't help but be impressed, even overwhelmed by what he saw. Now, when he wrote that, he was just making his observations. I don't think he was trying to look systematically at what the Jews had that might someday enable them to stir themselves up and muster the resources to rebuild that nation, that state in the land of Israel. But when I went through his writing very carefully, I found half a dozen elements that he has located of Jewish strength, of Jewish passion, of Jewish commitment, and I want to touch on them, showing where they come from in what he wrote, and then I want to expand on all 6 of them to see what kind of strength that gave the Jews as they stood at the beginning of the 19th century. And then I'm going to take 3 of those elements and demonstrate how during the course of the 19th century they played themselves out in ways that moved the Jewish people significantly closer to having the possibility of their own state. So what are those half dozen elements? So the first one is the Bible. Right? This mysterious book that he's referring to is very clearly the Bible. And I think he understood, as all of us understand, that the Bible is about the love affair of the Jewish people with their God and with the land of Israel that their God gave to them and that they inhabited and caused to bloom and caused to be a real center of ideas and of prosperity. So he identifies first the Bible, second Hebrew, right? He literally couldn't buy a book in Hebrew from a father teaching his son because Hebrew meant so much, and this father is teaching his son in the same language that had been used in Chateaubriand's exaggerated account for 5,000 years, but even if one doesn't want to say that, certainly for more than 3 millennia. So he identified Hebrew as the second element. Third, he focused on the desire to return to Israel and Jerusalem. He emphasized the conditions are awful. It's absolutely terrible. And yet, look at them. They bury their dead in the shadow of Solomon's temple, and they live here, and they keep coming back. And 17 times they keep coming back. That's how much they're focused on the return to Israel and Jerusalem. Fourth, he identified the sense of peoplehood. Right? What does it take to risk your life in order to bury your neighbor after he's passed away? What does it take to want to come back and to live with this group of oppressed, impoverished people in this corner of the world when you have better opportunities in almost all respects in other parts of the world? It means not only do you love the land, but you must love the Jewish people, and you must feel a connection to the Jewish people. He also writes elsewhere that the Jews of Palestine had to regularly request assistance and receive it from the Jews of Egypt and North Africa. Again, a sign of peoplehood. So that's the fourth thing. The fifth thing he discerned was this messianic belief. Right? He understood, I don't know which Jews he talked to and what he was reading, but he intuited that one of these very few sentences about the Jews had to be devoted to their belief that the Mashiach, the Messiah, this king, was going to come. Right? That messianic belief was connected to their sense of chosenness. The Jewish role was not yet over. There were still more great things to be done. They were going to be done by the Jews together. They were going to be done with God's help. And they were going to be done in the land of Israel. And when you put all of that together, you have a messianism that provided a source of passion and inspiration for a very wide variety of Jews, regardless of their own personal level of Jewish practice. So messianism was the fifth element. And the sixth and final element is their resilience. 17 times they saw Jerusalem destroyed, and 17 times they came back to Jerusalem. And no matter how many blows they are struck with, they don't whimper, they don't cry, they don't complain. If they have to die, al kiddush Hashem, right, in praise of God's name, to show their resolute faith, then they put their head before the sword and let themselves die. But they just keep coming back and back and back. And all of that, this one very smart Frenchman picked up on his journey to Palestine. Now, I want to take each of those 6 points and unpack them, because there's a lot that he didn't know and a lot that he didn't write about that we need to understand in order to recognize what power there was within the Jewish people to rebuild their state. So the first of these points is the Bible. Right? When you think about it in kind of broad terms, the Bible is the story of the love affair that the Jewish people had and have with the land of Israel. It's a story of being out of that land and coming back into it. It's a story of loving that land, sometimes even in a sensual way, just being so deeply connected to it. When you're there, you're thrilled that you're there. When you're not there, you're yearning to come back, right? The story begins outside of Israel. So the Bible, as far as the Jews are concerned, begins when Abraham wants to go into Israel. And then he goes in and he has to leave for Egypt. And his grandson, Jacob, again has to leave for Egypt. And the central story of the Bible, of the Torah, is then the story of the Exodus from Egypt, which is nothing other than the story of the Jewish return to Israel. If you then look later in the Bible, especially the story of the prophets, what you have is the story of the kingdom that's created, but especially the exile, the destruction of that kingdom, the exile, and this belief that the Jews are someday going to return. And the Bible doesn't end. In a sense, it couldn't end until the Jews actually have come back. And the very last words of the Bible are Cyrus telling the Jews that they can be restored to Israel. And we have within the Bible descriptions of the Jews coming back under Ezra and Nehemiah. And so throughout the Bible, there is this sense that dwelling in Israel and returning to Israel is what we do. And one of the most beautiful psalms in the Jewish tradition, Psalm 126, is just 6 verses that express exactly that idea of the return, and that in a sense are the epitome of what many Jews take from the historical sections of the Bible. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. Restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them. Generation after generation of Jews imagine themselves not only as those who were crying, but also as those who were dreaming, not only as those who might plant, but also as those who would reap. And they got that first and foremost from the Bible. And that's a key element that the Jews had going for their national rebirth as of the beginning of the 19th century. Second thing is Hebrew, the language itself. Because there's a lot of talk, on which more later, of the revival of the Hebrew language, there's a misunderstanding that the Hebrew language was a dead language. It in fact never died. Hebrew was the language of the Bible, which was composed over a lengthy period of time. It was the language of many other books that were composed subsequently, of which the most important is the Mishnah, the oral law. It is true that the Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, the commentary on the Mishnah, includes a lot of Aramaic, which was a different language, although written for Jews in Hebrew characters. But it's also the case that all of the leading commentaries on both the Bible and on the Mishnah and on the Talmud were composed in Hebrew. Poetry of all kinds was composed by Jews in Hebrew across the generations. Business among Jews was often transacted in Hebrew because that was the lingua franca, as it was. It was the common language among Jews. And so the Jews carried with them Hebrew. So even at the beginning of the 19th century, more than a millennium and a half after there had been a significant Jewish population in the land of Israel, Hebrew was a language that Jews could read, very high levels of literacy, and that literacy was typically within the Hebrew language, at least for boys. Girls was a different story at that time. And so the Hebrew language also was something that potentially united the Jews and gave them this sense that they were still connected to the land and they were still connected to the book, the Bible, which was the love affair of the land. The third element is the focus on the return. And this is famously true in the prayer book, right? When there are certain times of the year that Jews pray for rain. And you could be, let's say, in England, where all theology aside, there's really not much of a reason to pray for rain because it probably is going to come anyway. Or you could be in areas where the rainy season is very different from that in Israel, and yet Jews pray for rain from the beginning of what is considered to be the rainy season in Israel until the end of the rainy season in Israel, even if they're in Siberia or in New York or in Bogota or in Paris or anywhere else. It's also this sense that our lives are built around the land, and we see it very, very clearly when, after meals, traditional Jews give thanks to God for the bread that they've had and for the meal that accompanied it. So if it's on the Sabbath, they will sing a psalm, and the psalm they will sing is precisely 126, those 6 verses that I read before. So as they're about to thank God for bread, which probably came from the bread belt in Iowa or from somewhere in Ukraine or from Argentina, they are thinking about their return to Zion. And then in the blessings that are said, all of a sudden, Uvnei Yerushalayim, and asking God to rebuild Jerusalem. And so the prayer book, which was the guide that accompanied Jews day in and day out, also focused them very much on this return. And there was another element of the return that was absolutely essential for the Jews, which is many of the greatest Jews actually returned to Israel or tried to do so. Right? Perhaps most famous among those who returned is the Ramban, Nachmanides, as he's sometimes called. He had written in his commentary on the biblical commandments that one of the affirmative commandments incumbent upon all Jews is to move to and settle in the land of Israel. And he put his life where his pen was, or his money where his mouth was, risked his life, came to Israel, established a synagogue, and in fact it's been reestablished, the Ramban synagogue within the old city in modern times as well. But for every famous leading Jewish figure who moved to Israel, there were many others who tried. So among the famous Jews who attempted to move to and settle in Israel, Rambam, Maimonides, ended up living mostly in Egypt. The Vilna Gaon from Lithuania had plans. But the idea was the very best of Jews should move to Israel. And there literally was never a generation in which there weren't Jews living within the land of Israel. So it was continuously settled. So that's the third element. The fourth element that Chateaubriand, I think, identified and that I want to expand on is the sense of peoplehood. This sense, Kol Yisrael arevim ze leze, right? All of Israel is responsible one for another. You saw this played out over Jewish history numerous times. The Jews in one area are attacked, murdered, driven out. They're accepted by Jews elsewhere. Jews in one area become tremendously impoverished. Those in a somewhat more well-off area give their tzedakah, which goes to people they've never met, gives their charity to people whom they have never seen. And this sense that we are all one people was something that pervaded Jewry in unexpected times and places, even among those who didn't realize how strong the sentiment was. The fifth element was this messianic belief that Jews, they got with their mother's milk. They got before their mother's milk. They just had this sense, we were chosen as a people to do great things. And we're not done yet. Right? Whether I'm sitting in Lithuania or I'm sitting in Germany or I'm sitting in Morocco or anywhere else in the world, our mission is as yet unfinished. And there is a God above, and that God above wants us to fulfill that mission, and he's going to help. And some of them replace that God above with other ideals, but those ideals generally focused on Jewish chosenness, on the sense of destiny, on the belief that in the end, and they didn't know when the end would be, but in the end, we would, as a people, do great things again. We would spread great ideas in the world, just as we had done in our book of books in the Bible. And we would come back to Israel, and we would serve as an Or Goyim, a light unto the nations, and bring about the betterment of humanity. And that was pervasive across Jewry around the world at the beginning of the 19th century, as it had been for so many centuries before. And finally, there was this real sense of resilience. And here I have to credit my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Daniel Gordis, who has written about resilience as this kind of central element of the Jewish tradition. He writes about it in the case of Tachnun, which is a prayer that's said, but he also writes about it in life. The assumption of traditional Jews were not just that we're going to face challenges and difficulties, but the terrible, terrible things are going to happen to our community or the neighboring community, if not in this generation, then in the next one. And we're going to come back. And we're going to come back quickly. And that's what it means to be a Jew. It's to see Jerusalem destroyed 17 times, and each time to come back. It's to see your own community be subject to a pogrom and rebuild. It's to see your own community expelled from one country and to rebuild as quickly as you can in another country. And that resilience was built into the DNA of the Jewish people. That, I think, was some of the things that the Jews had at the beginning of the 19th century. And what I want to touch on is how three of those developed during the course of the 19th century in ways that brought the Jewish people somewhat closer to being able to establish their state again. And the first one has to do with settling the land. Right after Napoleon's decree, shortly after Napoleon's proclamation, calling on Jews to settle Israel, and his convening of the Sanhedrin and getting them to agree that there was no Jewish nationhood, the ink was barely dry on that when a movement of students of the Vilna Gaon being the greatest scholar in Lithuania, in Vilna, which was called the Jerusalem of Lithuania, his students organized as a group to move to the land of Israel. And the traditions are difficult to pin down in terms of their historical veracity, but there's reason to believe that a couple of people by the name of Rivlin were the leaders of this group when they met in Lithuania, and they had an organized campaign. And I mention the name Rivlin because the current president of the State of Israel, Ruby Rivlin, is a direct descendant of the people who moved to Israel at that time. And they moved in 1808 and 1809, just when things seemed to be at their very grimmest. And there were waves of Jewish immigration for a variety of reasons during the 19th century, of which the most famous is the one that began, what's called by Zionist historians, the first Aliyah, that began around 1881 after the so-called liberator Tsar, Alexander II, was assassinated in Russia, and his son, Alexander III, took over in a climate in which Jews, who had been there were a couple of Jews who were involved in the assassination. It was by no means a Jewish plot, but in Russia, the common view was the Jews have murdered our Tsar, and we're going to get back at them. And there were a series of pogroms, Sufot Benegev, storms in the south and southern Russia, especially in the Ukraine, in which Jews were murdered and raped, and their possessions and homes were destroyed, and terrible, terrible things happened. And that brought about this wave of Jews who came to settle the land, and they built towns with names like Petach Tikva, the opening or beginning of hope, or Rosh Pinah, right, the kind of the cornerstone, which of course comes from what we say in the Hallel prayers, which of course comes from the Psalms. The building block that was rejected became the cornerstone, the Rosh Pinah, the cornerstone for the whole new world. And the Jews who had been rejected so much and in so many places around the world were coming back to rebuild places with names like Rosh Pinah. So we see the beginning of settlement in the 19th century. Second, we see an extraordinary revival of the Hebrew language. Right? As noted, it had never died, but what it was lacking was the ability to apply it outside of very narrow business contexts to the day-to-day vernacular of describing the world in which we live. And the real heroes of this story are the Jewish scholars who in the 1850s and 1860s established journals with names like Hashachar or Hamagid and others. And they had to create words to describe all of these new scientific phenomena, all of these new political phenomena, all of these new literary and cultural phenomena. And large numbers of Jews got their news from Hebrew newspapers, by which I mean weeklies or monthlies. Dailies were a little bit harder to produce. But it's an extraordinary story of people who chose to learn and write in a language that wasn't the language they had grown up speaking, for an audience that at the beginning barely existed, but that they believed could be formed. And in fact, more Jews got their news from papers in Hebrew than got it from papers in Russian or Polish or other languages in Central and Eastern Europe. So you have the kind of heroes of the story of the Hebrew revival, and of course Eliezer ben Yehuda, who moves from the Pale of Settlement, from that area where Jews were crowded under the Russian Empire, and moves to Israel with the idea that he will speak to his wife and his children only in Hebrew. And he won't let his children play with anybody else's children unless they learn too much Yiddish. And he will be hated by his neighbors because he won't let his children go on play dates. And he will be hated by his the members of what's called the Old Yishuv, the arch-traditionalists who believed that using Hebrew in the vernacular was sacrilegious. And yet he persisted in this, and his son is considered kind of the first native Hebrew speaker. Now, there were other Jews over time who had grown up speaking Hebrew, but nothing in an experiment of this kind, in a place where this was meant to bring about the beginning of the first Hebrew-speaking kindergarten and the first Hebrew-speaking primary school. And step by step, Eliezer ben Yehuda and others began to move the Jewish people so that Hebrew was not just the language used for prayer and for study and for sacred texts and for occasional business transactions, but a language that you could use 24/7. And the third element that really developed in the 19th century was this messianism. And it took on different forms. It took on the form of Rav Yehuda Alkalai, who was the forerunner of religious Zionism, writing towards the end of the first half of the 19th century. He wrote about the Jewish return and how this was something that was just foreordained and was going to happen. And he saw signs of it and believed it was something that could really be achieved in our world. It's Moses Hess in Rome and Jerusalem, a committed socialist who believes that at the end of the day, the Jews need to rebuild a Jewish state, and that state could serve as a socialist model for the world. And it's Leon Pinsker, writing in 1881, Auto-Emancipation, in response to this whole emancipationist movement that had been stirred by Napoleon and his Sanhedrin. This belief that the non-Jews will emancipate us and give us our freedom and our dignity and our equal civil and economic rights. And along comes Pinsker on the heels of these terrible pogroms in southern Russia and says, no, only auto-emancipation. We have to free ourselves, and we're going to do that by creating a Jewish state. Each of these was a flavor of messianism. Each of these reminded the Jews that it was, in fact, perhaps their destiny to take their greatest ideas and meld them with their greatest dream and rebuild their homeland in the land of Israel. And that brings us towards the end of the 19th century, when what is lacking to establish that state and make it a great state is first and foremost that leader, that visionary, that man of ideas and statecraft and resilience and determination and brilliance and genius and power and passion, who could take all of that and put it into a new movement that would move towards building this Jewish state in the land of Israel. That man, who emerged on the scene in 1895, was Theodor Herzl, and in our next session, we'll talk about who he was, what his challenges were, and how he brought the Jews so much closer to establishing their state.